Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stood up. It was March 1982, on a soundstage at Warner Brothers Studio in Burbank. The set of a Western that would later become one of Clint Eastwood's defining films as a director. Crew of 47 people. Cameras, lights, horses, period costumes. A production running 3 days ahead of schedule and under budget. The kind of professional efficiency Clint had built his reputation on. The morning had started like any other. Clint arrived at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes before call time. He walked the set quietly, checking marks, talking briefly with the cinematographer, nodding to the grips setting up equipment. No fanfare. No entourage. Just work. By 9 a.m., they'd completed 2 scenes. Good takes. Clean. The kind of work that happens when a director knows exactly what he wants and a crew trusts him completely. That's when the studio executive arrived. His name was Michael Drentel. 32 years old. Harvard MBA. Warner Brothers had hired him 6 months earlier as part of their new generation of production oversight. He wore expensive suits. He talked about demographics and marketing quadrants. He'd never made a film, but he had authority over budgets and final cuts. Drentel walked onto the set during a lighting setup, 2 assistants trailing behind him, carrying clipboards and coffee. He didn't wait for a break. He walked directly to where Clint stood beside the camera, reviewing the previous take on a small monitor. Eastwood, Drentel said. Not Clint. Not Mr. Eastwood. Just the last name, like calling a waiter. Clint looked up slowly. Said nothing. We need to talk about your shooting ratio. Drentel continued, loud enough that the entire crew could hear. You're averaging 2.3 takes per setup. Industry standard is 5 to 7. The studio is concerned you're not giving us enough coverage. The set had gone quiet. 47 people had stopped working, watching this interaction with the kind of tension that comes when you know something wrong is happening but you don't know how wrong yet. Clint's face didn't change. He turned back to the monitor without responding. Drentel stepped closer. Did you hear me? I'm talking to you about a serious production concern. I heard you, Clint said quietly, still looking at the monitor. Then you should respond when a studio executive addresses you. Clint turned off the monitor. He straightened up slowly, all 6 feet 4 inches of him, and looked at Drentel with that expression that had made him famous. Not anger. Not defensiveness. Just a steady, evaluating gaze that seemed to measure everything about a person in 3 seconds. My contract says I have final cut, Clint said, his voice low and even. And creative control. If you have a concern, you can put it in writing and send it to my trailer. Right now I'm working. Drentel's face flushed. His 2 assistants shifted uncomfortably behind him. Listen to me carefully, Eastwood, Drentel said, his voice rising. I don't care what your contract says. I don't care about your reputation. You're on a Warner Brothers soundstage, using Warner Brothers money, and you will answer to Warner Brothers oversight. Is that clear enough for you, or do I need to use smaller words? Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The crew was frozen. The cinematographer had lowered his light meter. The script supervisor had stopped writing. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Clint looked at Drentel for a long moment. Then he looked past him, at the 2 assistants. Then at the crew scattered across the soundstage. Then back at Drentel. You finished? Clint asked. I'll be finished when you start showing some respect for the people who sign your checks. Clint nodded once. Then he did something no one expected. He took off his director's headset and handed it to the script supervisor. He walked to his canvas chair, the one with Eastwood stenciled on the back, and sat down. He crossed his arms. And he waited. Drentel looked confused. What are you doing? Sitting, Clint said. We have a production schedule. Yes, we do. Then get back to work. No. The word hung in the air. Simple. Final. Drentel's confusion was shifting to anger. Excuse me? You said I don't respect the people who sign my checks? Clint said calmly. So I'm waiting for one of them to show up. Because you're not who signs my checks. You're middle management. And I don't take direction from middle management who walks onto my set and disrespects my crew by making a scene when we're working. Your crew? Drentel's voice was getting louder. These people work for Warner Brothers, not for you. They work with me, Clint corrected. There's a difference. Drentel turned to address the crew directly. Is everyone hearing this? Your director is refusing to work because he doesn't like being questioned about his methods. This is the kind of ego that costs studios millions. No one responded. 47 pairs of eyes stayed locked on Clint, waiting to see what he would do. What Clint did was continue sitting, arms crossed, expression unchanged, waiting. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The soundstage was completely silent except for the low hum of the lights overhead. Drentel was pacing now, his expensive shoes clicking on the concrete floor. His assistants were whispering urgently to each other. One of them pulled out a walkie-talkie and stepped away to make a call. Clint didn't move. At the 15-minute mark, one of the grips, an older man named Frank who'd worked on Clint's films for a decade, quietly walked over to Clint's chair. Boss, Frank said softly. What do you need? Nothing, Clint said. Just waiting. Frank nodded and walked back to his position. But something had shifted. Another crew member, the key grip, moved to stand near Frank. Then the script supervisor. Then the cinematographer. One by one, without being asked, without discussion, the entire crew gradually repositioned themselves in a loose semicircle behind Clint's chair. They weren't protesting. They weren't making a scene. They were simply standing with him. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. Drentel saw what was happening and his face went pale. He'd come to assert authority, and instead had created a silent rebellion. This is insubordination, Drentel said, but his voice had lost its edge. All of you can be replaced. Then replace us, the cinematographer said quietly. But this is Clint's set. And you disrespected him in front of people who've worked 12-hour days for 3 weeks straight without complaint because he treats us like professionals. Drentel opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at his assistants, who were both staring at their shoes. He looked at the crew, standing silent and unified behind a director who hadn't asked them to defend him but had earned their loyalty through 3 weeks of quiet competence and respect. Warner Brothers. We'll hear about this, Drentel said finally. I'm counting on it, Clint replied. Drentel turned and walked off the soundstage, his assistants hurrying after him. The crew didn't cheer. Didn't applaud. They just stood there, waiting for Clint to tell them what to do next. Clint stood up slowly. He put his headset back on. He walked to the camera and looked through the viewfinder. Then he turned to his cinematographer. Let's go again, he said. Same setup. We were getting something good. They shot the scene in 2 takes. Both were perfect. They wrapped that day on schedule. What happened next became Hollywood legend. Away from the cameras, Clint made a choice no one expected. That evening, Clint didn't leave the studio. He went to the production office and requested copies of every time sheet, every equipment log, every expense report from the first 3 weeks of shooting. He spent 6 hours organizing them into a presentation. The next morning, he called a meeting with Warner Brothers senior executives, not Drentel, but the people actually in charge of the studio. He brought his documentation. He brought his shooting schedules showing they were 3 days ahead. He brought his budget showing they were $340,000 under projected costs. And he brought his footage, the dailies from every scene they'd completed. He screened 30 minutes of raw footage without comment. Then he turned on the lights. That's what a 2-3 take average looks like, Clint said. No wasted film. No wasted time. No wasted money. I know what I want before I call action. My crew knows what they're doing. We work fast because we work professionally. He set down the budget reports. Your executive Drentel walked onto my set yesterday and humiliated me in front of my crew. Not because of a real concern. Because he wanted to assert authority. That's not oversight. That's ego. And ego costs time. Time costs money. Money costs everyone in this room. The executives, 3 men in their 50s who'd been running Warner Brothers since before Drentel was born, looked at each other. What do you want, Clint? One of them asked. I want to finish my film, Clint said. The way my contract says I can. Without interference from people who confuse activity with productivity. There was a long silence. Done, the executive said. Drentel won't set foot on your set again. Clint nodded once and stood to leave. Clint, another executive said, why didn't you just call us yesterday? Why sit there for 15 minutes? Clint paused at the door. Because if I'd lost my temper, I'd have been wrong. If I'd argued, he'd have had something to use against me. But silence? Silence lets people show you exactly who they are. And it lets everyone else see it too. The film wrapped 2 days ahead of schedule and $420,000 under budget. It became both a critical and commercial success. Clint went on to direct and star in multiple films for Warner Brothers over the next 3 decades. Michael Drentel was quietly reassigned to a desk position in marketing. He left Warner Brothers 6 months later. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, forever. 20 years later, Frank, the grip who'd been first to stand behind Clint's chair, was interviewed for a documentary about Hollywood production crews. He told the story of that morning in 1982. We all knew Clint could have destroyed that kid, Frank said. One phone call. One complaint. But that wasn't his way. He just sat down and waited. And we understood. He was teaching us something. Power isn't about volume. It's about knowing your value and refusing to negotiate it down. The cinematographer from that film went on to shoot 17 more projects with Clint. He kept a photo from that production on his office wall. A candid shot someone had taken of the crew standing behind Clint's chair during those 15 minutes of silence. That's the day I learned what leadership actually looks like, he said in an interview decades later. It's not charisma. It's not speeches. It's consistency. It's treating people with dignity even when you have the power to do otherwise. And it's knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing. Clint himself never spoke publicly about the incident. When asked about it years later during a press junket, he gave a response that was pure Eastwood. I don't remember that. I remember making a good film with a good crew. That's what matters. But privately, to young directors who came to him for advice, he would sometimes tell a version of the story. Not as a tale of triumph. As a lesson. Someone disrespects you in front of your crew. He'd say, you have 2 choices. Match their energy and prove they were right to dismiss you. Or show them what professional looks like. Let your work speak. Let your crew speak. And if you've done your job right, you won't have to say a word. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The chair from that production, the canvas director's chair with Eastwood stenciled on the back, is now in the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles. It sits in an exhibit about film production, surrounded by cameras and lights and equipment. But for the people who were there that day in March 1982, that chair means something different. It's a reminder that real power doesn't shout. Real leadership doesn't demand respect. It earns it through 1,000 small choices to treat people like they matter. Clint Eastwood never raised his voice that day. He didn't need to. He simply stood up. And then sat down. And in doing so, showed 47 people what dignity looks like when it's tested in front of everyone. The film they were making became a classic. But the crew who made it never forgot something more important. The day their director taught them that silence, wielded with purpose, speaks louder than any argument ever could. Share and subscribe. some stories deserve to be remembered. Years later, when young filmmakers asked Clint about leadership, he'd say only this: treat your crew the way you'd want to be treated. Show up on time. Know what you want. And never, ever let anyone disrespect the people who make your vision real. The chair sits in a museum now, but the lesson lives on in everyone who witnessed it. Real power doesn't explain itself. It just is.